Rain pressed against the hotel windows like 1,000 restless fingers, and Chris felt each one as he pushed his mop down the corridor. The carpet swallowed the sound, leaving only the soft churn of dirty water and the distant hiss of an elevator somewhere above. His uniform clung to him, damp at the cuffs, a size too big, as if it belonged to someone he was still trying to become. He kept his eyes lowered, not from shame exactly, but from habit, the kind learned early when attention was a risk rather than a gift. A door slammed behind him. The sound cracked the quiet and made his shoulders jump. From the corner of his vision, he saw a guest silhouette retreat, perfume lingering like an accusation. Chris paused, breath shallow, waiting for the aftershock, the complaint, the manager's voice, the familiar tightening in his chest. Nothing came. The corridor settled again, fluorescent lights humming with tired patience. He resumed mopping, careful to erase the footprints that never seemed to stop appearing. At the end of the hall, a brass plaque caught the light. 1408. The numbers gleamed as if polished by more than hands. Chris had cleaned his floor every night for 6 months, yet he still felt a small pull when he passed that door, an inexplicable pause in his step, as though the room held a different temperature. He told himself it was nonsense and rolled his cart onward. The evening unraveled slowly. A glass shattered in the banquet room, sharp as a gunshot, and Chris hurried over, heart racing, only to find a waiter staring at the mess, eyes wide with fear. Chris knelt and swept the shards, his fingers steady, the way his mother had taught him to move when things broke. He smiled to calm the waiter, a brief flash of kindness that went unnoticed by the supervisor already striding toward them. "Be more careful," the supervisor snapped, eyes fixed on Chris as if he were the one who had dropped the tray. The words landed with familiar weight. Chris nodded, said nothing, and pushed the broom again. Silence was safer. Silence kept the night moving. Later, in the staff room, he drank water from a paper cup and listened to the walls. Laughter seeped through from the kitchen, then a burst of music, then the low murmur of guests drifting past the door. Chris leaned against the sink and closed his eyes. He imagined another life, one where his name was spoken without irritation, where his hands were known for more than cleaning other people's messes. The thought warmed him and embarrassed him at the same time. When he returned to the corridor, a bell chimed softly. The elevator door slid open and released a man in a dark coat, tailored and unhurried. He moved with a stillness that made the hallway seem smaller, as if it leaned toward him. The man paused, checked the room numbers, and then looked up. For a brief second, his eyes met Chris's. There was no hurry in them, no dismissal, just recognition. Simple and surprising. "Good evening," the man said, voice low, deliberate. Chris answered without thinking. "Evening, sir." The words slipped out, old and automatic. He flushed, unsure why. The man smiled, not broadly, but enough to crease the edges of his eyes. He turned toward 1408, slid the keycard, and disappeared inside. The door closed with a muted click that felt heavier than it should have. The rest of the shift tightened. A guest complained about dust on a lampshade. Another demanded fresh towels at midnight. Each request stacked onto the last until Chris's shoulders burned and his patience thinned to a thread. Near the end, the supervisor cornered him by the service elevator, holding a clipboard like a verdict. "There was a report," he said. "A guest claims you were rude." Chris searched his memory, every interaction replaying in his head. He saw only his lowered eyes, his careful words. "I wasn't," he said softly, then wished he hadn't spoken at all. The supervisor's mouth flattened. "Watch yourself. We can't afford problems." The elevator doors opened and swallowed the supervisor whole. Chris stood alone, the hum returning, the ache settling deeper. He felt small, easily replaced, a shape anyone could step around. He gathered his cart and headed back down the hall, determined to finish, to survive the night intact. As he passed 1408 again, the door opened, light spilled out, warm and amber, carrying the scent of coffee and something clean. The man from earlier stood there, jacket off now, sleeves rolled, as if he had been waiting. "Hey," he said, gently, catching Chris mid-step. "You dropped this." He held out a folded cloth, one of the hotel's hand towels, fallen from the cot without notice. Chris took it, fingers brushing the man's hand. The contact was brief, ordinary, yet it sent a strange steadiness through him. "Thank you," Chris said. The man nodded. Long night. Chris glanced down the empty corridor, the quiet bearing witness. He hesitated, then answered honestly, "Yeah." The man seemed to consider this, then stepped back, leaving the door open. "Room 1408, he said, almost as an invitation, almost as a promise. He watched the door remain ajar, the light steady, the hush alive with possibility. Down the hall, a phone rang and stopped, like a question reconsidered. Chris felt the weight of the towel, the cot, the rules he had learned to obey. He thought of the complaint, the clipboard, the way his name disappeared into paperwork. He thought of the eyes that had met his without looking past him. Somewhere inside, a careful lock shifted. He took a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, and for the first time that night, he did not move away. The corridor waited, listening, quietly. Morning crept in without ceremony, a pale light leaking through the narrow window of Chris's room like an apology that arrived too late. The night had not ended cleanly. It clung to him in the stiffness of his back, in the taste of cheap coffee burned onto his tongue, in the faint echo of that open door still ringing in his ears. He lay still for a moment, listening to the building breathe around him, pipes ticking, footsteps above, life continuing without concern for whether he was ready to face it. He rose slowly, careful not to wake the ache in his joints all at once. The mirror by the sink caught him by surprise. His hair was flattened on one side, eyes rimmed red, jaw tense as if bracing for impact. He studied himself the way guests sometimes studied stains on their sheets, with mild irritation and the expectation that someone else would take care of it. He splashed water on his face and straightened his collar, practicing neutrality until it fit. Outside, the city was already loud. Cars argued at the intersection. A vendor shouted about fresh bread, and the air carried the sharp promise of heat. Chris walked toward the hotel with his hands in his pockets, shoulders slightly hunched, blending into the tide of workers who moved quickly, eyes forward, all of them racing toward obligations they had not chosen. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the ground itself remembered what he was supposed to be. Work began without greeting. He clocked in, took his cat, and slipped into the rhythm that kept him invisible. Clean, replace, move on. Clean, replace, move on. His mind wandered despite himself, replaying the previous night's smallest details. The warmth of the light, the steadiness of the man's voice, the way he had said the room number like it mattered. Chris scolded himself for lingering on it. Kindness was not a contract. Kindness did not promise safety. By midday, hunger sharpened his focus into something brittle. He ate standing up in the break room, half a sandwich wrapped in paper, chewing without pleasure. 2 co-workers whispered nearby, laughter cutting short when he entered. He caught fragments of words, not his name exactly, but close enough to graze. He lowered his head and finished quickly, the familiar mix of shame and defiance settling into place. The afternoon brought more of the same. A guest snapped at him for taking too long. Another didn't look at him at all. He absorbed it, smoothed it over, kept moving. Survival depended on momentum. Stopping meant feeling. Feeling meant risk. Yet even as he told himself this, his eyes kept straying to the elevators, to the numbers lighting up in sequence. Each time they passed 14, something in his chest tightened, then loosened, like a held breath released too soon. Late in the day, a supervisor pulled him aside again. The complaint from the night before had not disappeared. It had multiplied, passed through hands that did not know his face, solidified into something official. The words were careful, rehearsed, designed to sound reasonable. "We have to consider our image," the supervisor said. "We can't afford misunderstandings." Chris nodded, jaw clenched. He signed a form he did not fully read. The pen felt heavier than it should have. When it was over, he returned to his cot, feeling hollowed out, as if the building had taken something from him and filed it away. He wondered, briefly, what would happen if he simply stopped showing up. The thought frightened him more than it comforted him. Evening fell softly, washing the hotel in amber and shadow. The pace slowed, but the weight did not. Chris worked his way back to the upper floors, the carpet thicker here, the silence more deliberate. When he reached a familiar corridor, his steps faltered despite his resolve. Room 1408 sat at the end, door closed now, numbers dull in the low light. He told himself it was just another door. He told himself many things. He cleaned nearby rooms, moving closer without admitting it. His hands shook slightly as he wiped the handrail. He straightened a painting that did not need straightening. Time stretched, then stilled. Finally, the door opened. The man stepped out, phone in hand, brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up and seemed surprised, then quietly pleased to see Chris there. "Hey," he said again, like they were continuing a conversation instead of starting one. Chris swallowed. "Evening." The man nodded toward the cart. "You work hard." It was an observation, not praise, and it landed deeper for that reason. Chris shrugged, unsure how to respond. The man hesitated, then lowered his phone. "I'm Daniel," he said. "I don't think I caught your name." "Chris." Daniel smiled, wider this time. "Nice to meet you, Chris." The simplicity of it undid him. They stood there, two men framed by quiet luxury, separated by rules neither had written. Somewhere, a door closed. Somewhere, a call bell rang. Daniel glanced back at his room, then at Chris again, something thoughtful passing through his expression. "If you ever need a break," he said carefully, "there's coffee inside. No pressure." He waited, giving Chris space to refuse. Chris felt the old fear rise, loud and insistent, listing consequences, rehearsing regret. He also felt the exhaustion, the steady erosion of being unseen. He looked at Daniel's face, open, unguarded, and realized the risk was already there, waiting for him no matter what he chose. He nodded once, small but certain, and stepped toward the door as it opened, light spilling out to meet him, changing the shape of the hallway behind him. The room smelled of coffee and something faintly citrus, a clean, deliberate scent that felt chosen rather than accidental. Chris hesitated just inside the doorway, the carpet softer beneath his shoes and the hallway outside, as if even the floor knew it was meant for different kinds of footsteps. Daniel moved ahead without urgency, setting his phone down, giving Chris time to breathe. The door closed quietly behind them, sealing out the corridor and its watching silence. "Sit, if you want," Daniel said, nodding toward a small table by the window. Chris remained standing for a moment, unsure where to put his hands, his eyes tracing the edges of the room. Everything looked intentional. The bed was made without creases. The curtains were half-drawn, letting in a stripe of evening light that cut across the wall like a promise. He sat finally, perching on the edge of the chair as if prepared to flee. Daniel poured coffee into 2 cups, the liquid dark and steady. He slid one across the table, stopping short of Chris's fingers, careful not to assume. "It's nothing special," he said, "but it's warm." Chris wrapped his hands around the cup. The heat surprised him, sinking into his palms, traveling up his arms. He nodded. "Thank you." They drank in silence. It was not awkward, exactly, but attentive, as though both were listening for something beyond words. Outside, the city softened into dusk, the sounds muted by glass and height. Chris felt a strange loosening in his chest, a small release he did not yet trust. "You look tired," Daniel said gently. Chris almost laughed. The truth pressed close to the surface, sharp and sudden. He swallowed it back. "It's been a long day." Daniel considered him, eyes steady. "They don't make it easy for you here." The words were simple, but they landed with precision. Chris looked down at his coffee, watching a faint ripple fade. "It's fine," he said reflexively. Daniel didn't argue. He nodded once, accepting the answer for what it was. "Sometimes fine is the best we can manage." The quiet deepened. Chris noticed a photograph on the desk, turned face down, its corner worn. He looked away, embarrassed by his curiosity. Daniel followed his gaze and smiled faintly. "Old habit," he said. "I turn things over when I don't want to explain them." Chris smiled despite himself, the gesture unfamiliar and tentative. "I do that too," he admitted. "With questions." Daniel laughed softly, the sound warm and brief. It surprised Chris how easily it filled the space. They talked then, cautiously at first, about ordinary things. The weather, the city, the way hotels felt the same everywhere and nowhere at once. Daniel asked about Chris's shifts, listened without interrupting. Chris found himself answering more than he intended, drawn by the absence of judgment. Time slipped, unnoticed. The coffee cooled. The light outside faded to blue. Somewhere, a siren wailed and passed. Chris felt the shape of himself changing, not dramatically, but enough to notice. He was being seen, not as a role, not as a problem, but as a person allowed to take up space. Daniel stood and crossed to the window, hands in his pockets. "I should say something," he said, not turning around, "so there's no confusion." Chris's pulse quickened. He set the cup down carefully. "Okay, I'm gay," Daniel said simply. No apology, no challenge, just a fact placed gently on the table between them. Chris absorbed it, surprised by how little it shocked him. He thought of the rumors he had heard, the jokes made in hallways, the warnings disguised as concern. None of them matched the man in front of him, calm and sincere. "All right," he said, and meant it. Daniel turned then, relief flickering across his face. "I didn't invite you here for anything like that," he added quickly. "I just didn't want you to feel misled." Chris nodded. "I don't." The truth of it settled into him, quiet and solid. What he felt was not fear, but curiosity, and something softer beneath it. Respect, perhaps. Gratitude. Daniel returned to his chair, the tension easing from his shoulders. They talked some more, the conversation deepening without effort. Daniel spoke of travel, of meetings that blurred together, of the loneliness that came with being known for a title rather than a name. Chris listened, surprised by the familiarity of it. Different lives, similar distances. When Chris spoke of his mother, of learning to clean because order felt like control, Daniel listened with the same care. A knock came suddenly at the door. Both men startled, the moment fracturing. Daniel stood, frowning, and opened it a crack. A co-worker stood there, eyes darting, curiosity poorly disguised as concern. "Everything all right?" she asked, her gaze slipping past him. Daniel's voice was polite. "Cool. Yes. Thank you." The door closed again, but something had shifted. Chris felt it immediately, the return of weight, of rules pressing in. He stood, smoothing his uniform. "I should go," he said. Daniel nodded, understanding shadowing his expression. "Of course." At the door, Chris paused. He turned back, meeting Daniel's eyes. "Thank you," he said again, the words fuller now, "for seeing me." Daniel held his gaze. "Anytime." Chris stepped into the hallway, the door closing softly behind him. The corridor looked the same, but it no longer felt empty. As he walked away, heart steady, he knew the kindness he had been offered was fragile, visible, and therefore dangerous. And somewhere behind that closed door, a choice waited, patient and watchful, ready to be tested. The rain had returned, tapping insistently against the window of room 1408 as if to remind the world that storms were not only outside but inside as well. Chris lingered near the doorway, hesitant, unsure whether to step fully into the warmth or retreat to the safety of the hallway. Daniel was seated at the small desk, a stack of papers in front of him, fingers tracing the edges with a careful deliberation that made Chris feel both welcome and intruding at once. The light was low, amber spilling across the carpet, painting their shadows long and tentative. "You look like you have questions," Daniel said without looking up, voice soft but precise. Chris hesitated, unsure where to begin. The truth of the last few days had piled high, layered with gratitude, confusion, and a lingering unease. Finally, he found one thread. "Why? Do you trust me? I mean, after everything." The words were uneven, uncertain, but genuine. Daniel paused, setting the papers aside. His eyes met Chris's, steady and unflinching. "Because I know what it feels like to be overlooked, to be counted as less than you are." He leaned back, letting the silence hang, heavy with thought and memory. People rarely see the pieces that are hidden, the corners where we store ourselves to survive. Chris took a step closer, drawn by something in the rhythm of Daniel's speech. "Pieces hidden, you mean like me?" His voice cracked slightly, betraying more than he intended. Daniel's expression softened, almost imperceptibly. "Exactly like you," he said, then paused. "And also like me." Chris blinked, processing. There was a subtle tremor in Daniel's hands as he lifted a photograph from the desk. It was black and white, edges frayed, a younger man with a quiet smile. I wasn't always seen, Daniel continued, voice low, almost confessional. Even power, even success, it can't erase the isolation we carry. Sometimes it just hides it behind better lighting. Chris felt something he had not allowed himself for years: recognition. Not pity, not judgment, but recognition. He swallowed, nodding slowly, aware of the quiet pulse in his chest. The room seemed to breathe with him, carrying the echo of the storm outside and the storm inside both, bound together by this fragile revelation. He took a step forward and dared to sit in the chair opposite Daniel. The air between them was taut but not uncomfortable, heavy with unsaid truths waiting for acknowledgement. "I never thought someone would notice," Chris admitted. His hands twisted the cup in his lap, the porcelain sweating in his palms. "Not really." Daniel's gaze held his. "Noticed? Yes. Understood. Maybe. That is rarer." He gestured to the papers still on the desk. "Sometimes the world asks us to perform, to conform, to survive, and we forget the small truths of who we are." Chris absorbed the words, the honesty cutting through the fatigue that had coiled around him for months. And then the weight of an unspoken question pressed against him. Why room 1408? The words slipped out before he could temper them. Daniel's smile was faint, ironic, and sad. "Because it's not a room where people notice themselves," he said softly. "It's the kind of room where you can hide in plain sight, where you can test courage and honesty quietly, where choices weigh differently because no one else is watching." He let that hang, the silence deepening the revelation. Chris understood then, not with his head, but with something lower, visceral. The kindness, the attention, the invitation. It was not just generosity. It was intentional, calculated with care. He realized that the man who had offered him warmth and recognition had also offered him responsibility, a chance to confront himself. The gravity pressed down in his chest, heavy and terrifying and exhilarating all at once. Daniel stood, moving toward the window, hands resting on the sill as he looked out into the night. "I've made mistakes," he said quietly, almost to himself. "And some of them have been cruel, not in intent, but in consequence. I know the weight of unseen choices, and I try to bear them carefully. But the world, it doesn't forgive carelessly. It assumes weakness, exposure, failure." Chris watched him, understanding at last that the calm voice, the measured kindness, was built from pain and vigilance. The revelation reframed everything. It explained the patience, the deliberate gestures, the way Daniel's eyes always seemed to measure risk and safety simultaneously. He was not merely generous. He was mindful of survival, of consequence, of the fragile balance between recognition and judgment. Chris's own history rose unbidden. The moments of invisibility, of being spoken over, of hands trembling at the weight of unnoticed responsibility, all converged. He saw himself reflected in Daniel's confession, a mirror of endurance, a pattern repeated across different faces, different lives. Recognition became understanding. Understanding became empathy, and empathy settled into a quiet resolve. This wasn't simply about gratitude or attraction. It was about integrity, courage, and the unlearning of fear. The storm outside shifted then, wind gusting, shaking the trees beyond the glass. Chris felt the walls of the room expand, the air itself seeming to pulse with the weight of unspoken truths. He realized that the conflict he had been facing, the fear of being unseen, the threat of dismissal, the precariousness of existence, was now entwined with Daniel's own struggle. Their histories, though different in circumstance, were parallel, intersecting in this fragile space of understanding. Daniel turned slowly, the rain light catching his features in a stark, cinematic contrast. "You see now," he said, "that what we face isn't just about being noticed. It's about what we do with that attention, what we allow ourselves to claim, even when it scares us." Chris nodded, words failing him. He felt the enormity of it, the gift, the responsibility, the revelation. This kindness was not unconditional in the naive sense. It carried weight, and he had to rise to meet it. The truth was heavy, but it was also liberating. Recognition did not mean possession. Attention did not mean safety. And yet, it opened a door he could not have opened alone. The room fell silent, the rain outside tapering to a soft drizzle. Chris felt a tremor of anticipation, the delicate tightening of possibilities waiting to be tested. He realized he was on the threshold of something he had long denied, not merely survival, but engagement with a life that demanded awareness, courage, and the acceptance of unforeseen truths. Daniel's presence was not simply comfort. It was an invitation, a challenge, and a revelation all at once. Chris took a breath, steadying himself against the surge of emotion. He understood that the storm was far from over, that the world outside would not pause, and that exposure always carried consequence. Yet inside this room, in the quiet aftermath of confession, he felt the first flicker of agency, of choice, of readiness to face what came next. The papers on the desk glimmered in the low light, insignificant in form but heavy with implication. Chris's gaze lingered on them, knowing that soon he would have to confront what they represented, not only in terms of work or expectation, but as symbols of the larger challenges Daniel had hinted at. Responsibility, truth, exposure. They all converged in a single thread, fragile and taut, waiting for him to grasp it. And then, just as he lifted his eyes, Daniel's voice, soft and deliberate, cut through the quiet. "Chris, there's something else you should know. Something that changes everything you think you understand about this place, and about me." The words hung in the amber light like a quiet threat and a promise at once, the weight of revelation stretching into the unknown, and Chris felt the stirrings of fear and resolve entwined, knowing that what came next would demand everything he had begun to reclaim. The morning air was sharp, carrying the scent of rain-soaked asphalt and distant exhaust fumes. Chris walked toward the hotel with a measured pace, each step deliberate, weighted with purpose. The streets were busier than usual, voices echoing off concrete walls, horns insisting for attention, and the low hum of the city threading through it all. He clutched the edges of his uniform shirt, as if bracing against more than the wind. Today was different. He could feel it in the tightening of his chest and the steadiness of his breath. Inside, the lobby was alive with the usual chaos. Luggage wheels rolling, guests murmuring, clocks directing traffic. Chris moved through it with quiet precision, each movement honed by months of routine. But routine alone could not steel him for what awaited. The supervisor from earlier weeks loitered near the front desk, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning the room like a hawk searching for prey. Chris caught his gaze briefly. The look was sharp, evaluating, ready to pounce. He let it slide, refusing to give the acknowledgement it sought. Today, he carried more than a mop and cart. Today, he carried a voice that had begun to form in the shadows of observation and care. The meeting room was small, suffused with muted lighting that softened the edges of everyone gathered. The crowd had gathered not for celebration, but for evaluation, a performance of morality, compliance, and subtle judgment. Chris entered last, unnoticed at first, a shape among many, but no longer invisible. He saw faces he recognized from passing corridors and whispered conversations, their expressions layered with curiosity, expectation, and a quiet skepticism that made his stomach tighten. Daniel was already there, standing near the head of the table, calm and deliberate. He caught Chris's eye and gave a subtle nod, a silent encouragement that grounded him. Chris moved to his seat, chest rising with a faint tremor of anticipation. This was not a battle of fist or force, but of courage. And courage, he knew now, demanded presence. The first speaker rose, a manager whose tone was measured, practiced. "We had reports concerning staff conduct," she said, scanning the room. Her eyes landed on Chris last, as if his arrival completed the picture. "And we need to address the responsibility of our team members." Chris felt the familiar surge of anxiety, the old impulse to shrink and disappear. But he remembered Daniel's words, the quiet weight of acknowledgement, and the recognition of agency. He straightened, sitting taller, and waited. One by one, accusations and murmurs unfolded, small grievances magnified into statements of character. Chris's hands rested lightly on the table, fingers tapping in rhythm with his heartbeat. When it was his turn, the words came slowly at first, measured with care. I've made mistakes," he began, "but I've also learned from them. I've tried to listen, to see what was needed, not just for me, but for the people around me." Murmurs traveled through the room. Some were dismissive, others hesitant, almost curious. Chris's gaze swept the faces, noting the subtle shifts, the doubt softening, the skepticism faltering. He drew a breath and continued, voice steadier, gaining momentum from a quiet support he felt in Daniel's presence. Being unnoticed taught me patience. Being underestimated taught me awareness. And being overlooked taught me what it means to carry responsibility with dignity, even when no one is watching. There was a pause, heavy with expectation. The manager's pen hovered over a sheet of notes, the sharp click of the markers snapping in the stillness. Then Daniel spoke. His voice cut through the tension with calm authority, not loud, but impossible to ignore. Chris has shown integrity, perseverance, and insight. He doesn't just follow instruction. He observes, adapts, and cares. That is not weakness. That is not error. That is a mark of someone who understands their worth and the worth of others. The room seemed to shift. Eyes that had been narrowed with judgment softened slightly. The whispers faltered, replaced by the low hum of reconsideration. Chris felt the energy change around him, a tide reversing, lifting him from the weight he had carried for months. Yet opposition remained, subtle but persistent. A colleague spoke, tone clipped, words lined with accusation. We're not here to evaluate character, just performance. Chris's fingers curled around the edge of the table. He met the gaze of the speaker, then shifted to the crowd, speaking slowly, deliberately. Performance without respect, without understanding, without seeing the person in front of you, what value does it hold? If we measure only compliance, we forget humanity, and humanity is what sustains us even in failure. A hush settled over the room. Even the clock seemed to pause. Chris's words, simple yet deliberate, resonated in the silence. He realized that this was not just about defending himself. It was about articulating the principle that had carried him here, the truth Daniel had helped him recognize. Courage was not absence of fear, but action in its presence. Daniel's eyes met his again, brief but firm, conveying acknowledgement, pride, and quiet solidarity. Chris felt his heartbeat slow, his nerves steadied by the knowledge that he was not alone in the room, that support could exist even in spaces built to intimidate. The final remarks were not grandiose. They were careful, deliberate, a balancing act between authority and concession. The manager nodded, noting points, weighing the words he had heard. The room exhaled collectively, a slow release of tension, though not all opposition had vanished. Chris recognized the subtle retreat, the recalibration of judgment, and the quiet acknowledgement of integrity he had claimed. Outside, the wind shifted, rustling banners at the hotel entrance. Sunlight broke briefly through the clouds, casting fractured light across the lobby below. Chris imagined it as a signal, small but undeniable, that the tide had turned. Not completely, not forever, but enough to see that truth could be spoken and heard, that courage could survive scrutiny. When the session ended, Chris rose, collecting his belongings. Faces that had been rigid now carried softened expressions, tentative approval glimmering in subtle gestures. He stepped toward the door, and Daniel followed, matching his pace. They walked through the lobby together, the ambient noise of the hotel now a backdrop to something quieter, more personal. Chris's chest felt lighter, though aware that vigilance remained. Courage, he realized, was not a single act. It was a series of choices, each step claiming space and presence, each word spoken a small declaration against invisibility. He glanced at Daniel, whose eyes carried the same quiet satisfaction and recognition he had seen earlier, tempered now with relief. As they reached the elevator, the air between them was thick with unspoken understanding. Chris pressed a button, feeling the cool metal beneath his fingers, a tactile reminder of connection, of movement, of steps taken and steps yet to come. Daniel's hand brushed briefly against his, not in ceremony, but in affirmation, a subtle confirmation of shared acknowledgement. The door slid closed with a soft sigh. Chris leaned slightly against the wall, exhaling slowly, savoring the tremor of accomplishment beneath the lingering fear. He knew the day was one not in applause, but in the quiet reclamation of dignity, in the assertion of self amid scrutiny. Yet even in victory, a shadow of caution remained, a reminder that recognition could be fragile, temporary, and hard-won. And as the elevator descended, Chris caught sight of a reflection in the glass, himself upright, steady, and more aware than he had been when the storm first pressed against his shoulders. But in the background, the faint gleam of room 1408 lingered, a promise that the challenges ahead were only beginning, and that the revelations waiting behind closed doors might yet demand more courage than he had ever known. The morning light fell soft and golden across the hotel lobby, brushing the polished floors with a warmth that felt deliberate, as if the building itself had taken a deep breath and exhaled relief. Chris walked through the space with a steadiness he had not known before, shoulders relaxed, eyes lifted, noticing details that had once been invisible. The bell desk gleamed. The scent of fresh flowers hung faintly in the air, and somewhere above, an elevator hummed a calm, rhythmic song. Today, the hotel felt alive with possibility rather than scrutiny. He paused briefly near the front desk, listening to the soft murmur of guests, the clatter of luggage wheels, the polite exchanges between staff and visitor. None of it was new, but it resonated differently now. He no longer felt like a ghost passing through, invisible and unclaimed. Each step he took carried the weight of experience, the knowledge of endurance, and a quiet confidence earned in the corridors, the rooms, and in the brief, luminous encounters with Daniel. Daniel appeared at the far end of the lobby. Sleeves rolled, tie loosened, a quiet authority in his posture that drew the eye without demanding it. His gaze met Chris's, and he smiled, not the reserved, careful expression of early meetings, but a genuine curve of relief and pride. Chris returned the smile, feeling the warmth settle between them, a shared understanding that had been forged through storms, revelations, and quiet courage. They moved together toward the elevator, side by side, unspoken rhythm carrying them forward. Chris's thoughts drifted back to the weeks of struggle, the long nights of cleaning, the moments of humiliation, the trembling hand that held a broom when the world had seemed determined to erase him. And now, those memories had transformed, reframed by the kindness and recognition Daniel had offered, the lessons of dignity and self-worth quietly absorbed into every fiber of his being. When the elevator doors slid closed, the small, reflective space seemed to compress time. Chris could feel the pulse of change, the awareness that he had grown into a version of himself stronger than the one who had first walked the halls, timid and unseen. Daniel leaned slightly against the polished wall, gaze thoughtful. "You've come far," he said quietly. "Not because I said so, but because you chose to see yourself." Chris nodded, letting the words sink. "I didn't know I could," he admitted. The confession was simple, yet it carried the weight of months of fear, doubt, and quiet perseverance. The elevator descended slowly, every floor a reminder of the distance traveled, not measured in steps or rooms, but in courage reclaimed and agency embraced. Outside, the city was waking fully. Cars moved with purpose, pedestrians streamed past, voices overlapping in a chorus that no longer intimidated but invigorated. Chris stepped out onto the street, sunlight catching his hair, casting shadows that seemed to confirm presence rather than diminish it. He breathed deeply, feeling the pulse of the world meet his own, an acknowledgement that he belonged, even in small increments, to this rhythm. They walked together toward the park nearby, a rare pause in the relentless order of hotel corridors and guest expectations. The grass glistened with dew, the early sun threading through the trees, creating mosaic of light and shadow across the path. Chris felt the tension in his shoulders ease, each step grounding him in the present, in a place that allowed reflection without judgment. Daniel stopped at a bench, gesturing for Chris to sit. He followed, careful, deliberate, aware that this pause was both reward and preparation. "You faced a storm," Daniel said, voice low, even, and steady, "and you've held yourself accountable without losing who you are. That is rare, and it is powerful." Chris glanced at him, absorbing the words not as praise but as recognition. He remembered the nights of doubt, the silent questioning of worth, the weight of being unseen. And now, in this quiet moment, he understood that recognition was not a gift bestowed but a mirror held, a reflection of what had always existed. His chest lifted, a breath released that he had not realized he had been holding. They sat together, watching the world unfold. Children chasing each other across the grass, joggers moving in steady rhythm, the wind threading through branches. Chris felt the culmination of months of trial, kindness, revelation, and courage settle into something tangible. This was more than survival. It was affirmation, a confirmation that one could emerge from invisibility with dignity intact and identity reclaimed. Daniel's hand rested briefly on the bench beside Chris, a silent reassurance. "You're ready," he said. "Not because the world changed for you, but because you changed for yourself. And that is something no one can take." Chris looked down at his hands, remembering the trembling grip of mop handles, the careful brush of glass shards, the instinct to shrink. Those hands were steady now, carrying not only strength but history, memory, and the quiet wisdom that came from endurance. He smiled softly, eyes lifting to meet Daniel's once more, gratitude and understanding flowing in the shared silence between them. The park seemed to pulse with life and quiet acknowledgement, a witness to the growth that had taken place. Chris realized that courage was not a single act of defiance but a series of conscious choices, moments of vulnerability met with intention. Recognition, he understood fully, was as much about claiming oneself as it was about being seen by others. As they rose to leave, Chris felt the subtle weight of future responsibility pressing lightly on his shoulders, not a burden, but a challenge to remain present, engaged, and true. He stepped toward the hotel, the city beyond, the paths that would stretch forward, uncertain but navigable, illuminated by the lessons he had learned and the support he had earned. At the threshold of the hotel, Chris paused, glancing back at Daniel. The air between them carried unspoken acknowledgement. The journey was not over, but the next chapter had begun. He felt the faint stirrings of anticipation, of readiness, of the quiet thrill of possibility that awaited in the corridors, in the rooms, in the unseen spaces of life. The lobby doors closed behind them with a soft sigh, leaving the park bath in sunlight and shadow. Chris inhaled deeply, grounding himself, aware of the fragile equilibrium of courage, recognition, and selfhood he now carried. Somewhere, behind the walls and floors of the hotel, room 1408 remained a quiet sentinel, a symbol of the unexpected moments that transform lives, a reminder that change is patient, deliberate, and sometimes hidden in the light of ordinary days. As they walked away, a distant bell chimed, echoing faintly through the structure. Chris's gaze lingered on the hotel, the familiar corridors, the doors behind which lives intersected quietly, profoundly. The sun shifted, catching the windows at just the right angle, scattering light across the path before him. And in that reflection, he glimpsed not only what he had survived, but what he was ready to face, an open world, full of challenge, possibility, and the quiet, steady pulse of human connection. Courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about standing even when you are. If this story touched you, tell me where you're watching from. Because somewhere out there, someone's still fighting their storm, and your kindness might be the light they need. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.